Garrett, you can call me like the good teacher would.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay.
Hey, Beth, are we recording?
Just did, and it's 11 o'clock, so I'll admit all, okay?
Very good. We'll get started. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this wonderful program, a three-part series on discussions of music and justice. My name is Mark Kligman. I'm the director of the UCLA Lowell Milken Center for Music of American Jewish Experience. The inspiration for this project is a wonderful work written by Dave Brubeck in 1969 called The Gates of Justice. In today's program, we'll get into more detail on this work, but we want to let you all know that The Gates of Justice will be performed at UCLA on February 26th at 4:00 p.m. Pacific time, and we hope that you can join us in person. And if not, this will be shown online, and you can check our website, and we'll put information on the chat. So to get today's program started, which is the first of a three-part series, our host for this program is Garrett McQueen. And Garrett McQueen is an accomplished bassoonist and a musician who's played with symphonies across the United States and has performed many new works. He's a nationally syndicated radio host and has been part of many programs, including the Sound 13. He's an activist who focuses on music and racial equality. His two very influential podcasts, Triloquy and Trillworks, are him as both co-host and executive producer. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Garrett McQueen, who will then introduce our guests for today and the program. Garrett, we look forward to a wonderful program.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hello, good morning, or good afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from right now. And thanks again for being a part of this presentation. Again, my name is Garrett McQueen. I work in the field of classical music as a bassoonist, as a content creator and broadcast professional, as an arts administrator and activist, and as a thought leader at the intersections of race, contemporary culture, and the broadening of the idea of classical music. It's my great honor to be joined today by Chris Brubeck and Neal Stulberg, who I'll tell you a little bit about. Grammy-nominated composer Chris Brubeck continues to distinguish himself as an innovative performer and composer who is clearly tuned into the pulse of contemporary music. The Chicago Tribune described Chris as a composer with a real flair for lyrical melody, a 21st century Lenny Bernstein. Hello, Chris. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And heralded by the Los Angeles Times as a shining example of podium authority and musical enlightenment, Neal has garnered consistent international acclaim for performances of clarity, insight, and conviction. Since 2005, he has served as Director of Orchestral Studies at the UCLA Herb Alpert School of Music, and from 2014 to 2018, he served as Chair of the UCLA Department of Music. Neal, hello, and thank you for being here.
Thank you, Garrett. Delighted.
So as I briefly mentioned in my introduction, arts activism is a huge part of my work. The idea of music and justice is very important to me because I think music has the power to inspire thought around exactly that, justice. We can all speak to music's healing power or its ability to teach us about the past and the present, maybe even the future, but it isn't always positioned as something that can inspire justice. So to get us started, Chris, I wonder if you can speak to why this program, Music and Justice, is something that aligns with your personal engagement of music and love for this art form.
Well, growing up in the household of Dave Brubeck, I just knew how committed he was to social issues and for the endless quest for judgment. And he was of that generation that went through World War II. I mean, he was in Europe in Patton's army. And you see what can happen when society gets too out of whack and tilts the wrong way, and authoritarian regimes, take over. So he was just, he knew he didn't live in some kind of bubble. He knew that with his artistic talent, he actually had to develop skills by studying with Darius Milhaud to be able to write for chorus and orchestra and try to get these strong messages of brotherhood and a spirit of cooperation and social justice for all. And he really stuck to his guns. He wrote so many pieces where that was his theme time after time. And it was all corresponding to events that happened in American society.
Hmm. Neal, Chris used the phrase "in a bubble," and I think it's very easy for musicians to find ourselves there again, as I mentioned, focusing on that as opposed to thinking about the broader world. I wonder what your personal engagement has been when it comes to engaging what's outside of that so-called bubble of the rehearsal room, the concert hall, the podium in your case.
Well, one of the great joys of being on a faculty at a great public university like UCLA is that our students are not only wonderfully trained, very, very proficient musicians, but they're really smart and and engaged and interested in these issues. So I certainly here at UCLA conceive of what I do with the students educationally quite broadly. Of course, we want to provide them with a very, very high level of pre-professional training. But at the same time, we want to model really the kind of engagement and programming and themes that we hope that they, as future musical leaders, will also adopt. So we've done a number of projects over the years here that have to do with the intersection of music and social issues, and this is, a very, very exciting installment of that.
Absolutely. And Neal, I'll actually stick with you because one of the things that I think about when it comes to this music industry, even the so-called classical music industry, is that it's really easy to become siloed, so to speak. You have conductors who focus on doing just that. You have performing musicians who want to spend all of their time in the practice room, administrators who focus on that, and so on. With these various fields of focus, it's easy for the work of justice aligned dialogue and things like arts activism to be pushed to the side by everyone. There are people who focus their lives on that, and then there's everyone else who lives in this ecosystem of the arts who have different focuses. There's, of course, no blame or guilt that, I'm trying to cultivate there, just making the point that it's so easy for a focus to make certain things like justice out of focus. So with all of that in mind, I wonder why you think dialogues like this should be engaged by people in every aspect of the field and how you engage that or try to cultivate that thinking among your students.
Yeah. Well, I mean, your question answers itself in a certain way. It's clear, particularly in the times we live in, that perhaps above all, we have to cultivate a sense in the generations coming up of good citizenship and of understanding of how one lives in a pluralistic society.
Hmm.
And it's a constant challenge. The field of classical music itself is kind of ripe for the rewarding of privilege. Young students, certainly some of them have much more opportunity to develop their skills because of the circumstances that they're born into. But once they're here, we try in as many ways as we can, not only to erase boundaries musically, which we really try to do here at the school, but also try to explain and again, kind of inhabit the idea that music and scholarship, performance and scholarship, composition and performance, all of these things really, they're not separate things. One really informs the other. And I think together, when someone begins to have that perspective, hopefully, not inevitably, but hopefully a more humanistic perspective develops, just because things are much more integrated and people have open minds and can understand connections better.
Mhm. And Chris, you spoke a little bit to this, describing the sort of ecosystem you grew up in, the household that you grew up in. But I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to this balance of the musical focus against really paying attention to how that musical focus can engage everything else.
Well, I mean, Neal said so many things that were right on target, but you have to be a sensitive human being to be a player and a performer and a composer. And I think that you really just have to open up to the world and what's going on around you. And when you make music, I think that all this is reflected somehow in how you're playing and how you're composing. At least that's the case for me. I was very fortunate because growing up in our house, I was able to hear like many of the finest jazz musicians of the world. And I grew up, colorblind. It was just like, wow, this guy's great. He's playing bass. And it happened to be Eugene Wright, who's a Black American. But, the jazz world is just filled with unbelievable shining stars of the music, that says everything to me. And I was so fortunate. I grew up, with an appreciation that this is an American art form, jazz, that started early enough that it's kind of young. But I mean, Louis Armstrong's one of the original guys, and I was even lucky enough to meet him, and Dave was lucky enough to record with him. And so it's amazing to be in touch with the roots of something that has grown so beautifully in America and now around the world. I mean, there was a time when I started playing jazz where you probably couldn't find super great burning jazz musicians in Japan, but now you can, and they're in Russia and every place I've traveled around the world. So there's something about jazz that's attractive. I think because there's such an equality as an improviser in any kind of group you are, in any place in the world, you get to speak your mind. And that kind of instant democracy in music is eternally appealing.
You mentioned Louis Armstrong. I won't get on my soapbox today, but visiting the museum where his home is in Corona, Queens, changed my life a few months ago.
Wow.
We'll have to dialogue about that another time. But among the many other great Americans of decades past is the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who is actually referenced in the piece, The Gates of Justice, through a very particular quote that I thought I might share here in context to get us to the next part of our conversation. So let's listen to a little bit of that here.
We must all learn to live together as brothers, or we will all perish together as fools. We are tied together in the single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the way God's universe is made. This is the way it is structured. John Donne caught it years ago and placed it in graphic terms. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And he goes on toward the end.
A little bit there again from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So in this upcoming program, it will include a performance of Dave Brubeck's The Gates of Justice. We'll talk about that work a little bit more here in a bit, and we'll actually hear an excerpt from the work as well. But I wanted to highlight that quote, when King said, "We must live together as brothers," people didn't hear it. Now they damn well hear it. That's something that people can read on the website for this event and hear in the piece of music, The Gates of Justice. So, Chris, I wonder if you can share your thoughts or reactions to this quote. What do you think was the statement that was really being made there?
Well, it's interesting because it's applicable to so many things because we're all co-inhabitants on this planet. But I don't think there was the wild concerns that there is now about climate change. And that's almost the first thing where we're damn fools if we don't straighten this out, because literally we're all going to kill each other, you know? So let's start with that. And then we have all the, racial overtones. And, my father considered Martin Luther King, I mean, that language, never mind the first line of the speech, which most of us know, but the other language is so beautiful. And my father really considered him a modern day prophet, which is why he wanted to juxtapose his words with the Old Testament biblical prophets that are also used as a text source for the gates of justice. And my mom and my dad, when they worked on big choral pieces, they really thought that the best way to penetrate a lot of the racial barriers or consciousness of people is to all the people that claim to be Christians, to stop a second and to hold the Bible up to the mirror and see if your face is in there too, and see these words. It would force people to look inside, and then you hear Martin Luther King's words. And for those that were suspicious of him as being, some sort of, communist rebel rouser, just see, man, he's basically, what he's saying is kind of do unto others as they would do unto you, in a different kind of more modern language. But that's the essence of it, respect for your fellow man. And we're all in this thing together.
And Neal, it's one thing for us to go back and study and revisit the words of these great leaders, but music does also have the ability to inspire thought, or I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Are the words alone enough, or how necessary is the music to actually fuel more than just the words?
Well, I think part of an answer to that question might be the number of works, musical works that have been written with texts from Dr. King. There was obviously a power there, and powerful words have always inspired powerful music. Music perhaps penetrates in a different kind of way, maybe a more ineffable or a purely oral way that can amplify the text. So I think as two people, Chris and I, who were who went through that period, and the trauma of the 1968 assassinations, the Democratic National Convention, Vietnam protests, civil rights protests. This is what really formed us politically, I would say, if I may speak for Chris. Generation. So the idea of a work that was explicitly trying to heal breaches and heal divides in 1969, when the country was torn apart in a way that we haven't really seen until recently, I would say. It just speaks to how much Brubeck must have felt these fissures deeply and wanted, as an artist, to contribute in whatever way he could to a more positive, unified energy moving forward in this very fractured and fraught country at that time.
Absolutely.
I'd like to add, if I may, that if you put it in context to the big pieces that Dave wrote, the first one he wrote was The Light in the Wilderness, literally on the teachings of Jesus Christ, for the reasons I mentioned before. The second one was The Gates of Justice. The third one, again, a big topic was I was, at the right age of just getting out of high school, Interlochen Arts Academy, getting ready to go to college. Vietnam was roaring. And there was the Kent State incident with the National Guard. So the next big piece Dave wrote was called Truth is Fallen. And truth is fallen in the streets and equity cannot enter. And my rock group represented the college kids age, and the percussion section was the martial law aspect of the National Guard. But, he just jumped right into that. And an also interesting twist is that it was the inaugural piece of the Midland Center for the Arts in Michigan, which was donated to heavily by Dow Chemical Association at that time, highly connected to the Vietnam War. And the people at the symphony were a little afraid that Dave's message was such a direct hit to the power structure that they actually had a meeting saying, do we need to withdraw this commission? Because this is where this piece is going. And amazingly, the head of Dow Chemical that represented them said, no, artists in our society have to be free to tell the truth.
We will definitely be talking a little bit about 2020 later on in this dialogue, but Neal, I feel compelled to ask, because you mentioned having lived through reverberations of this same issue in the past, I wonder
On my screen, Garrett is frozen.
On mine too.
Yeah, Garrett froze for me too.
Well, while he's frozen, I want to thank you all for presenting this opportunity.
Well,
Very
thank
good.
you.
Thank you.
Frozen.
Well, while Garrett's trying to reconnect, I hope, maybe Chris and Neal, you want to just continue where he left off. Just in terms of the impact that it's had and the musical influences for you.
Yeah, I mean, I'd be interested, Chris, to hear your thoughts about the universal resonance of the piece, in terms of any time versus the very kind of time-specific elements that brought the piece together, which we were just talking about. I mean, there are things in the piece that could not have been written today because they were of their time. They were absolutely in people's ears, and but I find it interesting, for example, in one part of the piece where he has the chorus shouting, "Make love, not war, make love, not war." There's a little note at the bottom that says something like, you can substitute other references if you'd like. It's just kind of leaving the door open to a more contemporary interpretation.
Yeah, that was a foresight, that it's going to change. Sadly, he probably suspected that it was going to go on too. I was with my parents the night that Obama was elected, and boy, there was a feeling of elation, like maybe we've finally taken this great step forward to a more equal and just society, and people getting over their prejudices. And if they had been around 6 years ago, it's one of the few times I'm glad my parents are not alive to have seen what happened and what started emerging. It's very sad, but it's also like a call for people of consciousness to double down and work harder, to do the things that you got to do to try to create more of a sense of enlightenment. And I think that music with text is very, very powerful. I'm sorry, I thought I heard a voice, someone coming in. Maybe not. Yeah, so Dave's feelings about music, that they just kept going. I mean, so the other thing about Dave, I'll just say at a more personal level, is that he was such a workaholic. It was just like amazing, because at first he was touring all the time as a jazz musician, and then he finally said, okay, I have one of the greatest jazz groups in the world, and it's great to play with these great musicians, but I got something more to say. And these messages of brotherhood and the power of biblical things, that they don't make for the greatest sort of jazz group, like scat singing about Jesus or something. I mean, there's probably people that have done it, but he had to go into this different field to express himself. And then after he did that for a while, going cold turkey on jazz for about a year, then he started playing with Jerry Mulligan and other musicians. So he kept going at it. But my dad, he would be riding on airplanes. And one of my most amusing memories of him is that we had an upright piano in his house that was elevated, because the doctor told him, Dave, you really should get more exercise. You should start riding a bike. And he's going like, yeah, but I'm busy riding and I don't have time to ride a bike. So he had a local carpenter build him a stand so that he could put his bike, stationary bike, under the piano, so he could practice piano while he was pumping the wheels. So I think that little story tells you a lot about how hard he worked at things.
I have a question, if we're still waiting for Garrett. For you, Chris, another question. Sort of come up. We know that your dad was, as you say, and as we know from documents, felt deeply about racial issues, about civil rights issues of the time. But what was it that prompted him to write something specifically about the Jewish community and the Black community? Was this also something in his experience that, indicated that he wanted to focus in on it, or was it the historical resonances of those two communities, both separate and together? What was the what prompted that direction?
Well, I think, I don't really know, because I wasn't living in his head, but I know for myself as a composer, like each piece that you write, if you're lucky, and I've been lucky, begats the next piece to come up. And, someone must have seen the light in the wilderness in Cincinnati, where it was performed with Eric Kunzel conducting. And a commissioning organization came to Dave and saying, we need a piece like this to help bring the Jewish and Black communities together, because as you said earlier, we feel that there's it's starting to unravel. We have so much more in common. We can't let the extremist voices, kind of rip us further apart. We're allies in this as oppressed people of centuries of slavery, and people that in our American society and world society, have something in common, which is to achieve a sense of justice and wherever we live. So I believe they came to him with that idea, and that resonated with him as like, wow, well, after I've written about the life of Jesus, this is a really interesting project. And I know that he has stated in writing and liner notes, etc., that once he got deep into this piece, he realized that the Black and Jewish communities, trying to bring them together, was like a metaphor. It was more than just those communities, that all over the world, there's all these different kinds of groups that are falling apart, and they should be bringing together. They should be allies. And so it became more and more a universal work as he worked on it. He didn't know that when he started, but he was discovering that as he went along.
Okay, I think I'm back. Apologies for unexpected technical difficulties there. I'm glad the conversation could continue. One of the things, I'm not sure where we left off, but one of the things, Chris and Neal, that I wanted to speak to was the idiom or this idea of jazz specifically being uniquely positioned to engage that unity that we're trying to work towards still to this day, and that these pieces of music work toward. You know, many people who are familiar with my work may have heard me use the phrase decolonize classical music, in the same way that classical music is different in India than it is in China, than it is in South America. Here in the United States, we have classic traditions that most certainly can be positioned as such, and unfortunately they haven't been. But history shows that idioms like the spiritual, like blues, and like jazz are definitely uniquely positioned to engage conversations exactly like this, bridging communities together and engaging this dialogue. I wonder, Chris, if you can speak to that point, the uniqueness of jazz specifically to help fuel this conversation forward.
Yeah, well, I think I mentioned it a little bit, but I want to start by saying my father, like my generation, like I love jazz and grew up hearing it, but I thought, okay, my dad's got jazz covered. I was really interested in being a very creative rock and roll musician, you know, and he didn't always love our music, but he knew a lot of the guys in my band were really good musicians, and they were like trained violinists and violists from Interlochen that also played electric guitar, you know, so he respected that. But he always said that, you know, the blues is the father of jazz and rock and roll. And, you know, and where does the blues come from? It comes from field songs, and, you know, and that's really about as folk music as you can get. So there is this connection, and I often say that there's a democracy you find in improvising jazz group, where people are each given an opportunity. It's like a town hall meeting or something, only with music. Everyone that's the tradition, you know, say something. You can, you know, make it up. You can make it up on the spot. You can play it. And it's also a beautiful thing to share with an audience, because as much as I love classical music and as brilliant as it can be, when I talk to people that love jazz music, they say, yeah, but there's nothing like that other thing, which is you're seeing music being created alive the first time in front of you, something that's never, ever happened before. It's not being recreated, it's being created. And that to me is part of the reason that Dave almost always has improvising jazz group as an element of the forces. There's orchestral, there's chorus, you know, percussion, brass, but there's this jazz element too. So it's got that extra edge of spontaneity that will help keep the music alive. Just as Neal was saying earlier, you know, some of the more modern things you can hear in the text, or things that I think that we're going to update some of the things that are going to be happening in this performance too. But for sure, all the jazz elements, you know, are stretchable and playable, and the groove can change a little bit, you know. I'm not saying we're going to come out and, you know, have a halftime show like Rihanna in the middle of the thing, you know, but, you know, Neal thinks it's a good idea. No, it's a malleable kind of a thing. The spontaneity is important and always will be.
It's funny that you bring up improvisation, because I often think about the similarities between musical improvisation and dialogue, as a sort of verbal improvisation. Neal, like many people who grew up and came up as a classically trained musician, a classically trained bassoonist, in my case, that improvisatory aspect of music making wasn't always highlighted or even seen as something important. I wonder how you sort of think about the reality that many of us live in as so-called classical musicians, as opposed to what's possible if we could really engage more of that jazz aesthetic, the blues, you know, what I consider American classical. How do you engage the conversation between, you know, the trained musician and really what we can be engaging through something broader?
I love this topic. I could talk about it for a long time. But basically, the way I see it, in the Western classical tradition, improvisation was always a very active element and became a kind of an atrophied muscle towards the end of the 19th century, maybe more beginning of the 20th century, as recordings became more ubiquitous, and so perfection became a much more important value, replication of of perfection. That was never the case before. In piano recitals of the late 19th century, people would walk out on the stage, they'd kind of play a little something, lead into one piece, and then maybe they would kind of have a little lead into another. I mean, this is, not to mention Baroque classical period, which of course, this is, part of it. But I agree completely with you. And in fact, I think in terms of kind of revivifying the tradition that I work in, teaching that tradition and understanding how important it is to make an audience feel like they're hearing something for the first time, even if they have heard it many times before, or even understanding the difference between, let's say, music that is what I would call expository, which is, music that kind of we know what's coming next, versus music that is improvisatory. The composer has written music such that we shouldn't know what's coming next. Right? So, and if a performer can't bring off that distinction, then they're really missing a lot of the music. I mean, in terms of the American jazz tradition and sort of just in general, non-classical traditions, what I'm finding increasingly in our students is there is not much of a distinction anymore. They're listening to everything. They're very, very universal in their interests, and certainly in the last few years, they are more interested than ever in, number one, engaging with contemporary music and of all kinds. And number two, really thinking deeply about their role as musicians, as social actors. And I think this happened after the George Floyd murder. I saw students who had never seen themselves, I know, as political actors, quite suddenly be kind of woken up about this and realize that they have a role to play in this. And so, in the way they construct programs now for themselves in their recitals and the kinds of things that they want taught, it really is, the demand is kind of coming up from the students themselves, from that generation themselves.
So, Chris, we're going to listen here in a couple seconds to an excerpt from The Gates of Justice, the movement, "Oh, Come, Let Us Sing a New Song." But before we listen to it, one thing that I wanted to name is that in the same way that there are many audience members who may have a typical idea of classical when they hear that word, the same may be true for the word jazz or blues and the many other lived experiences that went into the creation of this music. I wonder if you could speak to where all of these things meet when it comes to the Gates of Justice.
Oh, well, they're all over the place, and specifically the last movement that you're going to play this excerpt from. I know how my dad's mind worked, and in a way, it's the simplest idea, which took a lot of work, which is after a lot of music that relies on like cantorial modes, Middle Eastern things, that part of the Hebrew and Jewish tradition. Then the black baritone soloist, there's a lot of stuff that kind of emerges that has to do with spirituals and gospel music. And then this last thing, and it says in the bubble, oh, come, let us sing unto the Lord a new song. So Dave's going to say, I'm going to sing a new song. And suddenly he's got a completely different harmonic, well, not completely, but pretty damn different harmonic language that he throws down the gauntlet. at the end of this piece. Neal, you can probably speak to it more academically, but it damn near sounds 12 tones suddenly. I don't know if it technically is.
Absolutely. It is absolutely in the main a 12-tone movement with retrograde, with all these different procedures. Absolutely.
Wow. Well, let's take a listen here. Wow.
Could I just mention something about this very, very last vocal unison? Yeah. So at the end, we hear, just in a technical sense, a kind of D minor chord with the chorus singing an E flat right next to that D, a really gnarly sound. And then finally, in the last measure, they come to an E natural, which opens up the chord and opens up the gates. So this is the way his mind was working. It was a very, very advanced and communicative language.
Well, the other thing I'm struck about too is that with all the positive and sweet and sentimental different things, I mean, he could have been this piece in a very beautiful, we've gone to church kind of way. But to me, this sounds like warrior music. It's more like Carmina Burana or something, like we have got to fight for this change. And we're going to kick everyone's butt as they leave the concert. Like, there's almost a militancy to it.
Yeah.
Like, it's going to come easy, folks. We got to work for this.
Yeah, the idea that this isn't work that is done, but work that needs to continue, in many cases, even begin. Certainly when we speak to the intersections of these conversations and music, as we have experienced it. One of my favorite things about contemporary music is that it really, from my perspective, forces us to not forget about the humans behind the creation and even the performance of this music, and the humans who will be taking part in the performances of this work and the others that are on the program are quite diverse. We have music by Joel Thompson, performance by the ensemble Tonality, among many other folks. Chris, I wonder if you could speak to the significance of the diversity of performers. Is this something of note? Is this something that audience members should pay special attention to?
Well, I'll tell you is that the fine people that we're talking to here from UCLA and the Herb Alpert School of Music, as they started putting this program together, we talked about, different things we could do besides Gates of Justice or in addition to, but I really love that they've come up with contemporary artists and contemporary composers doing these things. I think it makes the whole program more exciting and breathes fresh air into Dave's things. So, to have other things in the program that are addressing, some of the same topics. And I've seen some of the musicians, the performers are extremely talented in a lot of different directions. And I think my dad would have totally appreciated the diversity. And of course, Arturo Farrell, is wonderfully talented. It's great. I mean, I'm really excited to hear everything else that's on the program, almost as much as I'm excited about playing Dave's music too.
Neal, I'll be frank. I think it would have been very easy for these performances to look like what has been typical in concert hall spaces for the past 100 plus years. But I think what this really showcases is the intentionality that's required behind the unity that we're seeking, and the dialogues that these performances will inspire. I wonder if you could speak maybe to the process of putting together the collaborators. What were the conversations that went into identifying the collaborators that we'll be hearing from?
Sure. Well, first of all, I really appreciate what you said about what both of you said about the first half repertoire. It was very important to us to sort of shoot this whole thing up into the present by including Jewish composers, Black composers, others, all living composers who are dealing with similar topics and similar themes in their music. Most of the first half repertoire is choral. There are two world premieres, one by Arturo O'Farrell for solo voice, string quartet, and jazz piano trio, based on the Langston Hughes poem, I Dream a World. And the other world premiere is by our other faculty member besides Arturo, Diane White Clayton, who is a singer, composer, pianist, conductor, you name it, who has written an extraordinary piece called Dear Freedom Rider, which is a piece for 11 singers, cellist, and pianist. And it is based on letters that the student singers have been asked to write to a freedom rider after having learned about this episode in history. Diane has sort of compiled these things together and generated a text from it. And I can't wait to hear that. So in terms of putting together collaborators, as I said, here at our School of Music, that sort of interaction is kind of, to me, the great promise of this school. And so, for example, last spring, I worked very closely with Arturo O'Farrell on a wild program involving music of Latin America and Mexico, and featuring Cornel West, who was a narrator in a piece for jazz, a large jazz band and orchestra that Arturo wrote. We had the Carlos Chavez Sinfonia India with its original indigenous instrument. We had our fantastic Los Angeles-based professional mariachi band, Los Camperos, joining us. You know, so this is not new for us, these kinds of collaborations. You know, and it was not difficult to interest colleagues, interest students, not only from our own department, but from across the school in participating in this. So Tonality is a professional chamber chorus in Los Angeles, which is founded and conducted by a graduate of ours named Alexander Lloyd Blake. He was a choral conducting master's student here at UCLA. I worked with him, and we all worked with him. India Carney, who is the solo soprano in two of the pieces, who was a finalist in The Voice, and a very prominent professional singer now, also an undergraduate with us. So there is definitely a UCLA angle to many of the performers who were selected, besides the fact that we just like them.
Of course. You know, Chris, this sort of melding and coming together of perspectives, cultures, is not new for UCLA, but it will be new for many audience members, certainly those who are used to the so-called typical concert experience. I wonder what that means to you, the fact that this will still, in the year of 2023, be a new experience for so many people.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question, because a while ago, you were touching upon, classical musicians and their bubble and stuff. And I just want to say that I'm old enough and have been doing this long enough that I've actually lived through some of the bridges of this. Like even playing bass in my father's group, we would work with orchestras in the 70s, and some of them were very hostile. Like, we don't want you rotten jazz musicians slumming up our stage. And they do things like come out on stage with about 50 pounds of Kleenex on their ears that we could clearly see because we were just too loud and, blah, 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 And they would make sure Dave got the second best piano. If there was a big Steinway backstage, they give him the crappiest one. I mean, we lived through this, even at his level of stature. That's how refined the snob level was. But thank God for Lynn Bernstein, and that's another part of this amazing lineage. My dad got to study with Darius Milhaud after World War II. Leonard Bernstein had become the Dudamel of the day with and he used to play like jazz piano in bars. You hear West Side Story, there's someone that's gotta love jazz to have composed that score. He respected Dave's music, and he said, we can do this. We can make soloists come in front of an orchestra like you'd have a violinist or whatever. This is a valid thing. Then you have Gunther Schuller coining the term the third stream music. Then he starts New England Conservatory. And I'm bringing all this up because this bridge goes to the point of when conservatory students started living side by side and in programs with jazz students when that was available. Then instead of jazz being this mystery thing of all these people they didn't understand, they went like, oh my God, these guys are amazing musicians. Plus they improvise. And then out of that, we saw the orchestra vibes change, the personnel. Now it's a beautiful thing. They sit around and they marvel at my brother Dan's drum solos or Darius's piano playing, and like, oh my God, you guys just made that up. How the hell did you do that? There's a great vibe, and it came through this educational sea change, which Neal's talking about at UCLA, which is blossoming big time with all these different cultures sharing the stage and sharing their music together.
And I'm so glad that the name Darius Milhaud has come up a couple times. We're actually going to listen to a little bit of Darius Milhaud. As important as it is to note historical challenge, I also think it's important to note the historical precedent for these blendings and meldings of cultures and perspectives. So we're going to listen to just how well, I suppose I'll say how well the Berlin Philharmonic can swing a little bit of the music of Darius Milhaud. We're going to listen here to an excerpt from his famous Creation of the World. I'd say the Germans did pretty good there. I think it's something again to highlight because we have there, in performance, German musicians performing the music of a French composer inspired by. Inspired by American aesthetics, even Black American aesthetics. I'll start with you, Neal. With this sort of precedent, does it give you hope? Do concerts like the one that's coming up, give you any hope for what we're actually working toward, considering that this conversation is not new, both in dialogue and musically?
Well, it does give me hope, and I think hope is really important to have right now because um, because if we don't reach out, if we don't make our concert halls look more like our societies and invite everyone in, because everyone can love all sorts of music. Talk about siloing. We're really siloing in terms of an orchestral life. You know, the orchestra's repertoire itself has kind of shrunk in a way. You know, the early music people have a kind of monopoly on the Baroque stuff now, and the contemporary music ensembles kind of do that. And the orchestra's kind of stuck a little bit in, you know, Mahler, Bruckner land, which are the, you know, these are great things. But as I was saying before, I really do think that this generation of musicians, at least in North America, let's say, are determined to kind of communicate the message of music in a very, very broad way. And I don't think they make distinctions. And, you know, good is good and not so good is not so good, which is sort of all that there is, really. So that's what gives me the hope. You know, California has just passed, incredibly enough, a bill providing for huge increases in funding for music education in the public schools. Unbelievable. You know, that's something that could be replicated in other places. A couple of years ago, I had the good fortune to spend several days in Havana with a group from UCLA and saw firsthand what happens in a country where music education is a right and a kind of as natural a form of early education as the academics. Unbelievable musical literacy and proficiency, and no boundaries, no siloing, really. Fantastic student orchestras, and, you know, etc. So, I mean, look, every place has its own challenges and its own difficulties, but I think there's a recognition, hopefully, that you know, as a old colleague of mine used to say, withholding music education from a student is like child abuse.
Wow.
You know?
I definitely agree.
Maybe we're sort of getting to that point where we can begin to understand that. And certainly, if they're going to be ambassadors who are equipped to get that message out, I think it's this generation of student musicians.
Absolutely. We're approaching the end of our hour, but Chris, you know, one thing that I wanted to make sure that I asked you specifically before we dismiss today, there are so many topics and there are so many issues that continue to keep communities separated, certainly Black and Jewish communities, but communities across the board. I think that there are also examples in which musicians and music institutions can take away some of those barriers. I wonder what your charge is to the musician of today, to the music teacher of today, the composer of today, to stay away from the things that keep us separated and instead lean more into the things that can break down those barriers, dismantle the things that separate us.
Well, I want to say in relationship with what Neal just said, that one of the great things you asked about hope, that when there's performances like this, there's a great hope to me, because I know it's a big surprise, but none of us is going to live forever. But a performance like this passes down an awareness of Dave and his music and what his generation, stood for. And all these young people involved in the performance, it's been transferred to them. So I feel good about that. And jazz, before schools came along, was always an oral tradition. I remember talking to the guys in Count Basie's band, like people would pick up like they, I don't know, they lost a sax player for some reason. They're in Kansas City. There's a kid, we hear he's good. He gets on the bus, and then that was his rolling education before there was a school. So for me, I grew up, in a jazz house, loving rock and roll and funk and the Beatles and George Clinton and all this kind of stuff, and classical music. And I'm a very eclectic composer, and I'm happy to say that there are more and more eclectic composers out there. And I think that makes a lot of people kind of get drawn to the music more, because it's not going to be, predictable what's going to happen. Not only is it not the next note or harmonically what's going to be predictable, what's the next texture? And I'm working on a piece right now for the Memphis Symphony. And it's interesting because they were telling me something that I think is a big, interesting idea. Why does every orchestra have to basically all sound kind of like they're trying to do the same thing? Why can't there be a Memphis sound to the Memphis Symphony?
I agree.
Or, if all the different identities we have, and like, obviously there's a big Latinx population in Los Angeles, and your last concert you talked about, like, Neal, where you're integrating that kind of sound. So I think there's change, and I think that the more we reach out and borrow from each other, the more interesting the music's going to become, because we need more and more musical vocabulary.
Absolutely. And I think that really is the key, expanding our perspectives, expanding our vocabulary, and that being the means of understanding more about each other and, in essence, loving each other even more. Chris, Neal, it's been phenomenal to share this hour with you. Thank you so much to everyone behind the scenes who helped make this possible. And we're looking forward to the concert later on this month. Thank you all very much for being here today.
Our pleasure. Thank you for all your hosting chops.
Yes, Garrett, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was